Helen Grant sat alone in her small office at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. The morning sun filtered through the blinds and cast thin lines of light across her desk. In her hand, she held a cream-colored envelope. The paper was thick and expensive. She had been staring at it for 10 minutes now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the raised letters on the front. The envelope contained an invitation to her son's graduation from the United States Naval Academy. Ethan was finally going to become an officer. 4 years of hard work and dedication were about to pay off. Helen felt her chest tighten with pride and something else, something that felt like fear. She opened the envelope carefully and pulled out the invitation card. The ceremony would take place in 3 days at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. She had requested leave months ago. Everything had been approved. Her bags were already packed. Her flight was booked for tomorrow morning. But she could not shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. Helen was not a woman who believed in bad luck or premonitions. She was a nurse. She dealt in facts and evidence. But 23 years in the Navy had taught her that plans could change in an instant. Lives could be saved or lost in the blink of an eye. She placed the invitation back on her desk and stood up. Through her office window, she could see the hospital courtyard below. A few patients in wheelchairs sat in the sun. Nurses moved between buildings carrying charts and medical supplies. Everything looked peaceful, normal. Helen walked to a small shelf on the wall where she kept a framed photograph. It showed a younger version of herself standing next to a tall man in a Navy uniform. Commander Jake Grant, her husband, Ethan's father. Jake had died 15 years ago in a training accident. A helicopter had gone down during a routine exercise off the coast of Virginia. 5 men had died that day. Jake had been one of them. Ethan had been only 7 years old at the time. Helen remembered how small he had looked in his black suit at the funeral, how he had refused to cry even when they folded the flag and handed it to him. He had been so much like his father even then, strong, stubborn, determined. After Jake died, Helen had thrown herself into her work. She had raised Ethan alone while serving on hospital ships and combat support hospitals around the world. There had been deployments to the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. There had been months away from home, missed birthdays, missed holidays. But Ethan had never complained. He had understood that his mother was serving something bigger than herself, and he had followed in her footsteps, or rather in his father's footsteps. He had applied to the Naval Academy and been accepted. Helen had been so proud she had cried for an hour. Now her phone rang. She picked it up and saw the name of her commanding officer on the screen. Captain George Peterson. Her stomach dropped. She answered the call. Captain Peterson's voice was calm but serious. There had been an incident at a forward operating base in the Middle East. A mortar attack had hit a barracks. 37 service members had been wounded, some critically. They were being airlifted to San Diego within the next 6 hours. All senior medical staff were being recalled immediately. Helen closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. Somehow she had known. She asked if there was any way she could be excused. Her son's graduation was in 3 days. It was the most important day of his life. Captain Peterson was sympathetic but firm. They needed every experienced hand they could get. The wounded were already in the air. There was no one else with her level of experience who could take her place. Helen thanked him and ended the call. She sat back down at her desk and stared at the invitation again. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. His voice was bright and excited. He was telling her about the final preparations for the ceremony, about how his uniform had been pressed and how he had practiced his salute in the mirror. Helen interrupted him gently. She told him about the recall, about the wounded service members who were coming, about how she would not be able to make it to his graduation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, but still strong. He told her not to worry about it. He said those guys needed her more than he needed her to see him walk across a stage. He said Dad would understand. He said he understood. Helen felt her heart break. She told him she would make it up to him. She promised. Ethan laughed softly. He said she had nothing to make up for. She was doing what she had always done, saving lives. Being a hero. They talked for a few more minutes and then said goodbye. Helen put her phone down and wiped her eyes. She stood up and grabbed her medical bag. There was work to do. The wounded arrived 4 hours later. Helen worked without stopping for 36 hours straight. She moved from patient to patient. She stabilized bleeding. She monitored vital signs. She assisted in emergency surgeries. She held the hands of young men and women who were scared and in pain. She wrote letters to families she would never meet. She did her job. By the time the crisis was under control and the last patient was stable, Helen was exhausted. She stumbled back to her quarters and collapsed on her bed fully clothed. She slept for 12 hours. When she woke up, she checked her phone. There were messages from Ethan, pictures from the graduation ceremony, him in his dress whites, him shaking hands with the superintendent, him with his classmates throwing their covers into the air. She had missed it all. Helen scrolled through the photos and cried. 3 months passed. Helen tried to bury herself in work, but the guilt never went away. She had missed the most important day of her son's life. Nothing could change that. Then one afternoon she received a letter in the mail. It was from the Naval Academy. She opened it expecting some kind of administrative notice. Instead, she found another invitation. The Academy was hosting a special recognition ceremony for family members of graduates who had been unable to attend the original ceremony due to active military service. It was scheduled for the following month. Family members would be honored for their sacrifice and dedication to duty. Graduates would be present to share the moment with their loved ones. Helen read the letter 3 times. She could hardly believe it. She called Ethan immediately. He already knew about it. He had been the one to nominate her for the recognition. He told her he would be there. He told her this time nothing would keep them apart. Helen felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in months. She accepted the invitation and began counting down the days. The morning Helen arrived at the Naval Academy, the air was crisp and cold. Fall had painted the trees in shades of gold and deep red. The campus looked like something from a postcard. Historic buildings with white columns stood against a bright blue sky. Midshipmen in uniform walked along the paths carrying books and talking quietly. Helen wore her dress uniform. Every ribbon was perfectly aligned. Every metal polished until it shone. Her silver oak leaf rank insignia gleamed in the morning light. She had spent an hour getting ready. This day meant everything to her. As she walked through the gates, she felt nervous. Her hands were sweaty despite the cool air. She had served in combat zones. She had treated wounds that would make most people faint. But standing here now about to see her son, she felt like a young recruit again, uncertain, hopeful. The ceremony was being held in Memorial Hall. Helen had been there once before, many years ago, when Jake had been stationed at the academy as an instructor. The hall was a sacred place. Its walls were covered with the names of graduates who had died in service to their country. Thousands of names stretching back over a century. Helen walked slowly through the marble corridors, reading the names as she passed. Each one represented a life given, a family left behind, a sacrifice that could never be repaid. She thought of Jake. His name was not on these walls, but he had given his life just the same. She touched the cold marble gently and whispered a prayer for all the names etched there. When she entered the ceremonial chamber, she saw about 20 families already seated. They were all in uniform or formal dress. These were people like her, parents and spouses who had served while their loved ones achieved great things, people who had made sacrifices, people who understood duty. Near the front of the room, Helen saw Ethan. He stood beside the podium in his dress whites. He looked taller than she remembered, more confident. The softness of youth had been replaced by the sharp edges of discipline and training. He was no longer the boy she had raised. He was a man now, an officer. When their eyes met, Ethan smiled. It was the same smile he had given her when he was 5 years old, and she had come home from her first deployment. That smile made every missed moment worth it. Helen took her seat in the front row. She glanced around the room and noticed a group of people seated near the back. They were in service dress uniforms, but something about them seemed different. They sat very still, very alert. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning the room. Helen had seen that look before. It was the look of people who had been in combat, people who were always ready for anything. She wondered who they were, but turned her attention back to the front as the ceremony began. A Navy chaplain stepped forward and offered a blessing. He spoke about sacrifice and service, about families who gave up precious time so that others could live, about the bond that connected all who wore the uniform. Then Rear Admiral Patricia Collins took the podium. She was the superintendent of the Naval Academy. A short woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her uniform was covered in ribbons and medals. She had served for over 30 years. Admiral Collins spoke clearly and with great feeling. She said they were gathered to honor not just the graduates but the families who had sacrificed alongside them. She said these parents and siblings and spouses had served in their own way, often giving up the most important moments so that others might live. She said their dedication to duty, even when it meant personal loss, embodied the highest ideals of naval service. Helen felt tears begin to form in her eyes. She looked at Ethan and saw that he was watching her. The expression on his face was one of such love and pride that her heart felt like it might burst. Admiral Collins continued speaking about the importance of family and the strength that came from knowing others believed in you. She talked about the unique challenges faced by military families, the deployments, the moves, the constant uncertainty. She said that military children grew up faster than others. They learned early what sacrifice meant. As the Admiral spoke, Helen noticed movement near the entrance to the hall. 2 men in dark suits had entered. They were not in uniform. They moved with purpose and confidence. Their faces were serious and cold. They walked directly down the center aisle toward the front of the room. Helen felt a prickle of unease. Something was wrong. The 2 men stopped right beside her row. One of them leaned down and spoke quietly, but his voice carried in the silent room. He asked if she was Lieutenant Commander Helen Grant. Helen stood up slowly. Confusion washed over her. She confirmed that yes, she was Helen Grant. The man straightened and pulled out a badge. He introduced himself as Agent Richard Stone from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The man beside him was Agent Kenneth Harris. Agent Stone said she needed to come with them immediately. He said it was a matter of national security. The room went completely silent. Every person turned to look. Helen could feel their eyes on her. She could see the confusion on their faces. Ethan took a step forward. His expression had changed from pride to alarm. Helen tried to understand what was happening. She asked what this was about. She said she was a Navy nurse. She did not have access to classified information. There must be some mistake. Agent Stone said there was no mistake. His voice was cold and official. He said they needed her to leave the ceremony right now. Helen asked if she was under arrest. Agent Harris replied that she was not under arrest yet. But if she did not cooperate, that could be arranged. Ethan moved quickly to stand between the agents and his mother. He demanded to know what this was about. He said his mother was a decorated officer who had saved hundreds of lives. Whatever they thought she had done, they were wrong. Agent Harris told Ethan to stand down. He said this did not concern him. Ethan said it absolutely concerned him. His voice was loud and angry. Admiral Collins approached the group. She asked the agents what was going on. She said this was a private ceremony. Agent Stone told the Admiral that with all due respect, this was a federal investigation. He said Lieutenant Commander Grant was a person of interest in an ongoing inquiry. He claimed the investigation related to unauthorized medical treatment of foreign nationals during her deployment to the Persian Gulf. Helen felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. Foreign nationals. She suddenly understood. 18 months ago, while serving on a hospital ship, her unit had responded to a call for medical assistance. A small fishing boat had been caught in crossfire during a skirmish. The boat had been carrying a family of refugees trying to escape a war zone. 3 children had been critically wounded. Helen had treated them. She had saved their lives. Later intelligence reports had suggested the children's father might have connections to insurgent groups. The information had been vague and contradictory. Helen had filed reports. She had followed every protocol. The family had been transferred to civilian care and eventually moved to a refugee camp. Helen looked at Agent Stone. She said she had treated wounded children. She had done her job as a medical officer. She had followed the rules of engagement and the Geneva Convention. If they had questions, she would answer them. But not here, not now. This was her son's ceremony. Agent Harris reached for her arm. He said she would come with them now. That was when everything changed. 10 people stood up from their seats at the back of the hall. They moved as one. Their movements were precise and controlled. They were all wearing service dress uniforms, but what caught Helen's attention were the gold tridents pinned to their chests. Navy SEALs. The man leading them was massive. He had graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Deep lines ran across his forehead and around his eyes. This was a man who had seen things most people could not imagine. He walked toward the agents with slow, measured steps. Each footfall seemed deliberate, purposeful. The other SEALs fanned out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. They did not rush. They did not make threats. They simply positioned themselves between the agents and Helen. The lead SEAL stopped a few feet from Agent Stone. His voice when he spoke was low and rough like gravel grinding together. He said his name was Senior Chief Daniel Carter. He very politely asked the agents to step away from Lieutenant Commander Grant. Agent Stone turned and looked at the senior chief. Irritation flashed across his face. He told Carter this was none of his business. He told him to back off. Senior Chief Carter did not move. He said actually it was very much his business. He explained that Lieutenant Commander Grant had saved his life. She had saved the lives of 3 of his teammates. She had done it under fire in conditions that would make most people lose their minds. So yes, this was absolutely his concern. One of the younger SEALs stepped forward. He had bright blue eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. He introduced himself as Petty Officer First Class Sam Rodriguez. He said Lieutenant Commander Grant had performed a field amputation on him during an ambush in Helmand Province. He would have bled out in 6 minutes without her. He was standing there today because of her. Another SEAL spoke up. This one was a woman with short dark hair and a thin scar along her jaw. She said her name was Lieutenant Julia Martinez. Lieutenant Commander Grant had treated her for shrapnel wounds and chemical exposure after a bunker breach. Helen had stayed with her for 12 hours, kept her breathing when her lungs were shutting down. One by one, the other SEALs shared their stories. A chief petty officer named Carl Bennett described how Helen had pulled him from a burning vehicle and treated his burns while still taking fire from enemy positions. A petty officer named Danny Wright told how Helen had diagnosed his internal bleeding when no one else could figure out what was wrong. She had saved his life with an emergency procedure performed in a field hospital with limited supplies. Each story was different, but they all had the same ending. Helen had saved them. She had kept them alive when death was seconds away. She had put their lives before her own safety. The families in the audience listened in stunned silence. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Ethan stood beside his mother with his jaw clenched. His eyes were wet, but he did not look away from the SEALs. Agent Harris shifted his weight. He looked uncomfortable. He said they respected everyone's service, but this was a federal investigation. They had their orders. Senior Chief Carter took another step forward. He was now standing directly in front of Agent Stone. The 2 men were the same height, but Carter had at least 50 pounds of muscle on the agent. Carter said they had their loyalty. He said Helen could be questioned later, tomorrow, next week, whenever they wanted. But they were not taking her out of her son's ceremony. Not today. Agent Stone's face darkened. He said this was obstruction of justice. Carter replied that it was honor, something the agents clearly did not understand. Another SEAL spoke up. His name tag read Lawson. He was tall and lean with calm gray eyes. He said they had spent their entire careers fighting for people who could not fight for themselves. That was what Lieutenant Commander Grant did every single day. She fought for the wounded, the dying, the helpless. If the agents had a problem with that, then they had a problem with every person in that room. Admiral Collins stepped forward. Her voice was sharp and commanding. She told Agent Stone and Harris to leave the hall immediately. If they had questions for Lieutenant Commander Grant, they could schedule a formal interview through proper channels. But they would not disrupt this ceremony. Agent Stone started to argue. He said the Admiral did not have the authority to interfere with a federal investigation. Admiral Collins cut him off. She said she had the authority to remove anyone from the Naval Academy who threatened the dignity and integrity of the institution. She said they were dismissed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Agent Stone looked at Helen. His eyes were cold and hard. He said they would be in touch. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Agent Harris followed. Their footsteps echoed in the silent hall. When the doors closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale. People began to talk quietly among themselves. Some of the family members applauded. The SEALs remained standing in their protective formation around Helen. Helen looked at Senior Chief Carter. She did not know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Carter must have seen the emotion on her face because he smiled. It was a small, tired smile. He told her she did not need to thank them. They were just returning the favor. Helen felt tears roll down her cheeks. She had spent her entire career taking care of others. She had never expected anyone to stand up for her like this. Ethan moved to her side and put his arm around her shoulders. He looked at the SEALs and said thank you. His voice broke slightly, but he kept his composure. Senior Chief Carter nodded at him. He told Ethan his mother was one of the finest officers he had ever served with. He said Ethan should be proud. Ethan said he was. Admiral Collins suggested they continue with the ceremony. She said they had come together to honor sacrifice and service. What had just happened was a perfect example of both. The families returned to their seats. The SEALs moved back to their positions at the rear of the hall. But they did not sit down. They remained standing. A silent honor guard. Admiral Collins resumed her speech. She talked about the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. She talked about loyalty and integrity. She said the men and women in that room represented the best of what humanity could be. When it came time for Helen to be recognized, she walked to the podium on shaking legs. Admiral Collins presented her with a certificate of appreciation. She said Helen had given up one of the most important moments of her life to save others. That kind of selfless service deserved to be honored. Helen looked out at the audience. She saw Ethan watching her with pride in his eyes. She saw the families who understood what she had sacrificed. She saw the SEALs standing at attention in the back of the room. And she understood something she had not fully grasped before. She was not alone. She had never been alone. There was a family that extended beyond blood. A family bound by service and sacrifice and shared understanding. That family would always have her back, just as she had always had theirs. After the ceremony ended, Helen stood with Ethan outside the hall. The sun was warm on her face. Ethan held her hand. He said he was sorry about what had happened with the agents. Helen shook her head. She said he had nothing to be sorry for. She was the one who should apologize. She had brought trouble to his ceremony. Ethan squeezed her hand. He said she had not brought trouble. She had shown him what real courage looked like, what real loyalty meant. He said watching those SEALs stand up for her had been more meaningful than any ceremony. Helen pulled him into a hug. They stood like that for a long time, mother and son. Two people who understood what it meant to serve. After the ceremony ended, Admiral Collins asked Helen to follow her to a private conference room. Senior Chief Carter came along as well. The room was small and windowless with a long wooden table and several chairs. The walls were covered with photographs of ships and submarines, maps showing naval operations from decades past. Admiral Collins closed the door and gestured for everyone to sit. Helen sank into a chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading. Now she just felt tired and scared. The Admiral sat across from her. Senior Chief Carter took the seat beside Helen. His presence was oddly comforting. There was something solid and dependable about him. Admiral Collins folded her hands on the table. She asked Helen to explain what had happened 18 months ago. What was this about treating foreign nationals? Helen took a deep breath and began to tell the story. She had been serving as chief medical officer aboard a hospital ship in the Persian Gulf. One afternoon, they received an emergency call. A small fishing boat had been caught in crossfire during a skirmish between coalition forces and insurgents. The boat was carrying civilians, a family trying to escape the conflict. By the time Helen's team reached them, 3 children had been critically wounded. A girl of 12, twin boys of 8. All 3 had sustained gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries. The girl had a punctured lung. One of the boys was bleeding internally. The other had lost part of his left hand. Helen and her team worked for hours to stabilize them. It was difficult, dangerous work. The family was terrified. The father kept trying to interfere. He was screaming in a language Helen did not understand. Eventually, they had to restrain him so they could work. All 3 children survived. Helen personally performed the surgery on the girl's lung. It took 6 hours. When it was over, the children were transferred to a civilian hospital. The family was eventually moved to a refugee camp in Jordan. Helen filed all the required reports. She documented everything. A week later, intelligence officers came to interview her. They said the father of the children was suspected of having ties to insurgent groups. They said he might have been providing information to enemy fighters. The intelligence was murky, based on intercepted communications and testimony from informants. Nothing concrete, nothing proven. Helen had answered all their questions. She explained that she had treated wounded children. That was her job. That was what the Geneva Convention required. The intelligence officers had seemed satisfied. They told her the matter was closed. Now, 18 months later, it had apparently been reopened. Admiral Collins listened without interrupting. When Helen finished, the Admiral leaned back in her chair. She said this was clearly political. Someone with an agenda was trying to make an example of Helen. Senior Chief Carter spoke up. He said he had heard things through his network of contacts in the special operations community. The family Helen had treated had not been connected to insurgents at all. The father was a schoolteacher named Omar Rashid. He had been documenting human rights abuses committed by both insurgent groups and coalition forces. He had been collecting evidence, taking photographs, recording testimony. Some people in the intelligence community had not liked that. They had tried to discredit him by claiming he was an insurgent sympathizer. When that had not worked, they had tried a different approach. They were going after the medical personnel who had treated his family. If they could prove that treating the family had violated military regulations, then Omar's testimony about the abuses could be dismissed. It was a way to silence him. Helen felt sick. She asked if this meant she was being used as a pawn in some kind of cover-up. Senior Chief Carter nodded. He said that was exactly what was happening. But he also said they were not going to let it succeed. Admiral Collins agreed. She said she was assigning Helen a military attorney from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. They would fight this investigation. They would expose it for what it was. Helen asked what would happen to her in the meantime. The Admiral explained that Helen would likely be placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. It was standard procedure. But she would receive full pay and benefits. And more importantly, she would have the full support of the Navy's legal team. Senior Chief Carter said Helen would also have the support of every SEAL she had ever treated. He had already started making calls. He was organizing a letter-writing campaign. Every service member whose life Helen had saved would be contacted. They would testify on her behalf. They would tell the truth about who she was and what she had done. Helen felt tears well up in her eyes again. She did not know what to say. These people barely knew her, yet they were willing to fight for her. Admiral Collins reached across the table and placed her hand over Helen's. She said Helen was not alone. The Navy took care of its own, especially when one of its own had been wronged. After the meeting, Helen walked back to where Ethan was waiting. The other families had left. Only the SEALs remained. They were standing together near the entrance, talking quietly. When they saw Helen approach, they fell silent. Senior Chief Carter introduced the rest of his team properly. There was Sam Rodriguez, the young SEAL with the bright blue eyes. Julia Martinez, the female SEAL with the scar on her jaw. Carl Bennett, a barrel-chested chief with a shaved head. Danny Wright, a quiet man with thoughtful brown eyes. Kyle Lawson, the tall, lean SEAL who had spoken during the confrontation. There were also 3 others. Marcus Webb, a demolitions expert, who had survived a mine explosion thanks to Helen's quick thinking. Angela Torres, a combat medic who credited Helen with teaching her advanced trauma techniques. And Patrick Flynn, a sniper who Helen had treated for a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Each of them shook Helen's hand. Each of them thanked her for saving their lives. Each of them promised they would do whatever it took to help her. Sam Rodriguez said he was due to testify before a congressional committee about special operations funding next month. He would make sure to mention Helen's case. Julia Martinez said she knew several reporters who covered military affairs. She would reach out to them. Carl Bennett said his brother was a lawyer specializing in military justice. He would offer his services for free if needed. One by one, they offered their help, their connections, their influence. Helen was overwhelmed. She had spent her career in the background, patching up wounds, saving lives, never asking for recognition or reward. Now here were some of the most elite warriors in the world offering to fight on her behalf. Ethan stood beside his mother, watching the SEALs with something like awe in his eyes. When they were done making their promises, he stepped forward. He thanked each of them. He told them what it meant to see them stand up for his mother. Senior Chief Carter put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. He said Ethan's mother was a hero. Real heroes did not do what they did for glory or recognition. They did it because it was right. He said Ethan should remember that as he began his own naval career. The mission was not always clear. The rules were not always fair. But doing what was right never changed. That was the only compass worth following. Ethan nodded. He would remember. The SEALs began to leave one by one. Each stopped to say goodbye to Helen, to wish her luck, to remind her she was not alone. Finally, only Senior Chief Carter remained. He handed Helen a card with his phone number on it. He told her to call if she needed anything. Day or night. He meant it. Helen took the card. She asked him why he was doing this, why he cared so much. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said that 6 years ago his daughter had been diagnosed with cancer. She was 8 years old. The treatments had been brutal. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. His daughter had been so scared, so sick. The nurses at the hospital had been angels. They had held his daughter's hand during the treatments. They had played games with her. They had made her laugh when she felt like dying. One nurse in particular had been there every day, had treated his daughter like she was her own child. That nurse had given his family hope when there was none. His daughter had survived. She was 14 now, healthy and strong. Carter said he would never forget what those nurses did. He would never forget the compassion and dedication they showed. When he had heard what was happening to Helen, he knew he had to help. It was the least he could do. Helen hugged him. It was unprofessional and probably against regulations, but she did not care. Carter hugged her back. When they pulled apart, he smiled. He told her this fight was not over, but they would win. Helen believed him. The investigation dragged on for 6 months. Helen was placed on administrative leave just as Admiral Collins had predicted. She remained at home in San Diego, receiving full pay but unable to work. The days felt endless. She had spent her entire adult life in service. Now she sat in her small apartment watching television and trying not to think about the future. Agents Stone and Harris were relentless. They interviewed everyone who had ever served with Helen. They combed through every medical record she had ever filed. They searched for any evidence of wrongdoing, any violation of protocol, any mistake, no matter how small. They found nothing. Helen's record was spotless. Every treatment had been documented. Every decision had been justified. Every action had been in accordance with military regulations and international law. But the agents kept digging. They seemed determined to find something. Anything. Meanwhile, Senior Chief Carter kept his promise. He organized a massive letter-writing campaign. He contacted every service member Helen had ever treated. Marines, soldiers, sailors, airmen, even a few Coast Guard personnel. The response was overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, hundreds of letters began arriving at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters. Each letter told a story. A young Marine corporal described how Helen had saved his legs after an improvised explosive device had shredded them. An Army captain wrote about how Helen had performed emergency surgery in a tent during a sandstorm. A Navy pilot talked about how Helen had treated him for smoke inhalation and burns after his helicopter had crashed. Some of the letters were from people Helen barely remembered. Patients she had treated for a few minutes during chaotic situations. Others were from people whose lives she had literally held in her hands. People who had been seconds from death. All of them said the same thing. Helen was a skilled, compassionate, dedicated officer who deserved to be honored, not investigated. The story began to leak to the media. A military blogger picked it up first. He wrote a long, detailed post about Helen's case. He explained how she was being investigated for saving children's lives. He described the political motivations behind the investigation. He called it a witch hunt. The post went viral. Veterans groups began sharing it. Active duty service members posted it on social media. Within days, major news outlets were covering the story. A cable news network ran a segment titled, "Navy Nurse Faces Investigation for Saving Lives." A national newspaper published an editorial condemning the investigation. A popular talk radio host spent an entire hour discussing the case with several military veterans who called in to express their outrage. Public opinion turned sharply against the investigation. Veterans organizations organized protests outside the Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters in Virginia. Dozens of people showed up carrying signs that read, "Support our medics," and "Helen Grant is a hero." Several members of Congress began asking questions. A senator from California, where Helen was based, wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy demanding answers. A congressman from Texas who had served in the Marines threatened to hold hearings. The pressure mounted. Ethan became one of his mother's fiercest advocates. He was now serving as a junior officer on a destroyer deployed to the Western Pacific. Despite the distance in his duties, he found time to write a long open letter to the Secretary of the Navy. In the letter, he described his mother's career, the sacrifices she had made, the lives she had saved. He talked about how she had missed his graduation to save wounded service members. He described the moment when agents had tried to remove her from the recognition ceremony. He explained how Navy SEALs had stood up for her. He called the investigation a travesty of justice. The letter was passionate and eloquent. It was also very public. Ethan posted it on social media where it was shared thousands of times. News outlets picked it up and quoted from it. The Secretary of the Navy was forced to respond. In a brief statement, he said the investigation was being conducted fairly and would be completed as quickly as possible. He said he could not comment on ongoing investigations, but that the Navy valued all of its personnel. The statement did nothing to calm the outrage. 3 weeks after Ethan's letter was published, Helen received a phone call from her attorney. Commander Lisa Harper was a sharp, intelligent woman who specialized in military justice. She had been assigned to Helen's case by Admiral Collins. Commander Harper said they had been summoned to a formal hearing. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service was ready to present their findings. The hearing would take place the following week. Helen felt her stomach drop. This was it. Her entire career, her reputation, her future all hung in the balance. She asked Commander Harper what she thought would happen. The attorney was honest. She said the evidence against Helen was weak, almost non-existent. But politics played a role in these things. There was pressure from somewhere high up to make an example of someone. Helen might be that example, or the public outcry might save her. It was impossible to predict. Helen spent the next week in a state of constant anxiety. She barely slept. She barely ate. She kept thinking about all the service members she had treated over the years, all the lives she had saved. Had it all been for nothing? Would her career end in disgrace because she had done her job? The day of the hearing arrived. Helen dressed in her service uniform. She made sure every detail was perfect. Commander Harper picked her up early in the morning, and they drove to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters together. Senior Chief Carter met them in the parking lot. He had insisted on attending as a character witness. He wore his dress uniform with all his medals and ribbons. He looked like a warrior. The hearing room was stark and official. White walls, fluorescent lights. A long table where 3 officers sat. A Navy captain named George Talbot was the presiding officer. He was flanked by a commander and a lieutenant commander. Both were judge advocates. Agents Stone and Harris sat at one table with their evidence and files. Helen and Commander Harper sat at another. Senior Chief Carter sat behind them in the gallery. There were also several reporters present. The Navy had decided to make the hearing open to the media. Probably because of all the public attention. Captain Talbot called the hearing to order. He explained the process. The agents would present their case. Then Helen's attorney would respond. Finally, Captain Talbot and his colleagues would deliberate and render a decision. Agent Stone stood up. He spent 2 hours laying out the case against Helen. He described the incident with the refugee family. He presented intelligence reports about the father, Omar Rashid. He argued that by treating the children, Helen had provided material support to someone with alleged ties to insurgent groups. He claimed this violated military regulations. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. Agent Stone had no concrete evidence. No proof that Omar Rashid was actually connected to insurgents. No proof that Helen had done anything wrong. His entire case rested on guilt by association. When Agent Stone finished, Commander Harper stood up. She was calm and precise. She dismantled the case piece by piece. She presented the Geneva Convention protocols that required medical personnel to treat all wounded, regardless of their affiliation. She showed Helen's service record. 23 years of exemplary service, hundreds of lives saved, dozens of commendations and awards. She presented testimony from witnesses, letters from service members Helen had treated, expert opinions from military ethicists and international law professors. She showed that the intelligence reports about Omar Rashid had been discredited. Multiple sources confirmed he was not an insurgent, but a victim of political persecution. He was now living in Jordan, working as a teacher and human rights advocate. His testimony about abuses in the conflict zone had been verified by international organizations. The real reason for this investigation, Commander Harper argued, was to silence Omar Rashid by discrediting the people who had helped his family. It was a politically motivated witch hunt that had no place in the military justice system. When Commander Harper finished, she called Senior Chief Carter to the stand. The Big SEAL walked to the witness chair and sat down. Captain Talbot asked him to state his name and rank for the record. Carter did so. Then he began to speak. He said he had been a SEAL for 22 years. He had seen combat in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. He had seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other. He had also seen the best. He had seen incredible acts of courage and compassion in the darkest moments. Lieutenant Commander Helen Grant represented the best of humanity. She did not see rank or nationality or politics when someone was bleeding in front of her. She saw a human being who needed help. That was not a crime. That was heroism. That was what separated the good guys from the bad guys. Carter talked about the time Helen had saved his life. He had been shot 3 times during a raid in Afghanistan. His team had carried him to a field hospital where Helen was working. He was losing blood fast. His blood pressure was dropping. He was going into shock. Helen had worked on him for over an hour. She had stopped the bleeding. She had stabilized him. She had kept him alive long enough to be evacuated to a better facility. Without her, he would have died. The recess felt like it lasted forever. Helen sat at the table with her hands folded, trying to stay calm. Commander Harper sat beside her, reviewing notes. Senior Chief Carter remained in his seat behind them. His presence was reassuring. Helen could hear the reporters whispering to each other. She could feel their eyes on her. Everyone was waiting. After 30 minutes, Captain Talbot and the other officers returned. They took their seats at the head of the room. Captain Talbot's face was unreadable. He looked down at a paper in front of him. Then he looked up at Helen. He began to speak. He said the panel had reviewed all the evidence presented. They had considered the testimony of witnesses. They had examined Helen's service record and the circumstances surrounding the treatment of the refugee family. He said the investigation had been thorough and fair, but the conclusion was clear. Lieutenant Commander Helen Grant had acted in full accordance with her training, her oath, and her duties as a medical officer. She had followed the Geneva Convention protocols. She had documented all of her actions appropriately. She had made decisions based on medical necessity, not political considerations. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, no violation of military regulations, no breach of duty. The investigation was officially closed. All charges were dismissed. Lieutenant Commander Grant was hereby reinstated to full active duty, with the sincere apologies of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service for the ordeal she had endured. The room erupted. Reporters began shouting questions. Senior Chief Carter let out a loud whoop. Commander Harper grabbed Helen's hand and squeezed it. Helen sat frozen. She could not quite believe what she had just heard. It was over. She had won. Captain Talbot banged his gavel, calling for order. He said he wanted to add something personal. He said cases like this were difficult for everyone involved, but they were necessary to ensure justice and accountability. However, this particular case should never have been brought forward. The evidence had been weak from the start, the motivations questionable. He said Lieutenant Commander Grant represented the finest traditions of naval service. She deserved recognition, not investigation. He hoped this experience would not diminish her dedication to her calling. Then Captain Talbot looked directly at Agents Stone and Harris. He said the panel was troubled by certain aspects of how the investigation had been conducted. There would be a separate review of the procedures used. That review would determine if any disciplinary action was warranted against the investigating officers. The 2 agents went pale. Agent Stone opened his mouth as if to protest, but Agent Harris put a hand on his arm. They remained silent. Captain Talbot adjourned the hearing. Helen stood on shaky legs. Commander Harper hugged her. Senior Chief Carter came forward and shook her hand. His grip was strong and warm. He told her he had never doubted the outcome. She had truth on her side. Truth always won in the end. The reporters swarmed around them, asking questions. How did Helen feel? What would she do next? Did she plan to take legal action against the agents? Commander Harper stepped forward and politely declined to answer questions. She said Lieutenant Commander Grant needed time to process what had happened. There would be opportunities for statements later. For now, they just wanted to celebrate this victory. Outside the building, the bright sunlight felt almost blinding. Helen stood on the steps taking deep breaths. The air smelled clean and fresh, like the world had been washed clean. Senior Chief Carter stood beside her. He said she should take some time off, rest, recover. She had been through hell. Helen shook her head. She said she wanted to get back to work. She had been sitting idle for 6 months. There were people who needed her help. Carter smiled. He said that was exactly what he had expected her to say. That same evening, Helen called Ethan. He was on duty aboard his ship, but he answered immediately. When she told him the news, he let out a yell so loud she had to hold the phone away from her ear. He said he had never doubted her. He said he was so proud. He wished he could be there to celebrate with her. Helen said they would celebrate together soon. His ship would be returning to port in a few weeks. They would have dinner. Just the two of them. Ethan said he would hold her to that. Before they hung up, he told her something else. He said watching her go through this ordeal had taught him something important. He said he had always known his mother was brave, but he had thought bravery meant facing danger without fear. Now he understood that real bravery meant standing up for what was right even when the whole world seemed against you, even when it would be easier to give in. His mother had shown him what true courage looked like. Helen cried after they hung up, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and gratitude and overwhelming love for her son. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Helen returned to work at the Naval Medical Center. Her colleagues welcomed her back with applause and hugs. Many of them had written letters on her behalf during the investigation. They had never stopped believing in her. The story of her case continued to generate media attention. Several news programs did follow-up reports. Veterans organizations used her case as an example of why military justice needed reform. Some lawmakers began drafting legislation to protect medical personnel from politically motivated investigations. Helen gave a few interviews. She was uncomfortable with the attention, but Commander Harper convinced her it was important. Her story could help others. It could prevent future witch hunts. In one interview, Helen was asked if she had any regrets about treating the refugee children. She answered without hesitation. She said she had no regrets. She would do it again tomorrow. Every child deserved medical care regardless of who their parents were or what side of a conflict they were on. That was not politics. That was basic humanity. The interviewer asked if she was angry about the investigation. Helen paused before answering. She said she was disappointed that it had happened. But she was not angry. The system had worked eventually. The truth had come out. Justice had been done. She was grateful to everyone who had stood by her. The SEALs, the Admiral, her attorney, her son, the hundreds of service members who had written letters. They had reminded her that she was part of something bigger than herself. A family bound by service and sacrifice. That family had protected her just as she had always protected them. 6 months after the hearing, Helen was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. It was one of the highest non-combat decorations in the Navy, given for heroism involving voluntary risk of life. The ceremony took place aboard an aircraft carrier off the coast of California. Hundreds of people attended. Sailors and Marines in dress uniforms, distinguished guests, family members of people Helen had treated over the years. Ethan stood in the front row wearing his dress whites. His face shone with pride. The Secretary of the Navy herself presented the medal. Catherine Ford was a dignified woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She pinned the medal to Helen's uniform and then stepped back and saluted. She said Lieutenant Commander Grant had exemplified the very best of naval service. Her courage, her skill, and her unwavering commitment to saving lives regardless of personal cost embodied the values the Navy held most dear. She was a credit to her uniform and an inspiration to everyone who wore it. The crowd erupted in applause. Helen looked out at the sea of faces. She saw Senior Chief Carter standing with the other SEALs. They were all there. Sam Rodriguez, Julia Martinez, Carl Bennett, Danny Wright, Kyle Lawson. All of them. They stood at attention saluting her. Helen's eyes filled with tears. She returned the salute. After the ceremony, Helen and Ethan stood together near the ship's railing. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The water sparkled like it was covered in diamonds. Ethan put his arm around his mother's shoulders. He said he was sorry she had to go through the investigation. Sorry that people had tried to destroy her career. Helen shook her head.
She said she was not sorry.
The experience had taught her something valuable. She had learned that she was never alone, that there were people who would stand up for what was right even when it was hard, that truth and justice still mattered. Ethan said he had learned something too. He said he had always wanted to make his father proud. But now he understood that the best way to honor his father was to live with the same principles his mother had shown: integrity, compassion, courage. Helen pulled her son close. She said his father would be so proud of him, so proud of the man he had become. They stood together watching the sun sink below the horizon. Mother and son, two people who understood that service meant sacrifice, that duty sometimes came with a price, but that the price was always worth paying when you fought for what was right. 5 years after the ceremony at the Naval Academy, Helen stood on the deck of a hospital ship anchored off the coast of Somalia. The sun was setting over the Indian Ocean, turning the water into liquid gold. Helen leaned against the railing and watched the light fade. She was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the tired that came from meaningful work. The ship had been on station for 3 months, providing medical care to refugees fleeing violence in East Africa. Helen's team had treated thousands of patients: malaria, malnutrition, infected wounds, diseases that had been eradicated in the developed world but still ravaged the poorest parts of the planet. It was difficult work. The conditions were challenging, the resources limited, but it was also rewarding. Every life saved was a victory. Every child who left the ship healthy was a reason to keep going. Helen thought about how different her life could have been if the investigation had gone differently, if she had been drummed out of the Navy, if she had given up. But she had not given up. She had fought, and she had won. Now she was still serving, still saving lives, still making a difference. A young corpsman named Luis approached her. He was one of the students who had been in her class 2 years ago. He had requested assignment to Helen's team specifically because of her reputation. He said there was a patient who wanted to see her, a woman with her children. Helen followed Luis down to the medical ward. The ward was crowded with patients lying on cots. Nurses and corpsmen moved between them, checking vital signs and administering medications. The air smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Near the back of the ward, Helen saw a woman sitting on a cot with 3 children. The woman was thin and worn-looking. Her face was lined with worry and exhaustion. But when she saw Helen, her expression changed. Recognition flashed in her eyes. She stood up quickly. She spoke in accented English. She said she knew who Helen was. She had been looking for her for years. Helen was confused. She did not recognize the woman. But then the woman gestured to the children, a teenage girl and 2 younger boys. The girl had a scar on her chest. One of the boys was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Suddenly Helen understood. These were the refugee children she had treated on the hospital ship 8 years ago. The children whose father had been suspected of being an insurgent. The children whose treatment had nearly destroyed her career. Helen felt her breath catch. The woman introduced herself as Fatima. She said her husband Omar sent his regards. He was still in Jordan working at the school, but she and the children had returned to Somalia to help with relief efforts. They had been working at a refugee camp when violence broke out. They had fled to the coast hoping to find help. When they learned there was an American hospital ship nearby, Fatima had hoped against hope that Helen might be here. The teenage girl stepped forward. Her name was Amira. She spoke English fluently. She told Helen she was studying to be a doctor. She would be starting medical school next year in Jordan. She said she remembered the day Helen had saved her life. She did not remember much, just pain and fear, and then a woman with kind eyes telling her everything would be okay. That woman had been Helen. Amira said she had decided to become a doctor because of that day, because someone had cared enough to save her life. Now she wanted to do the same for others. She wanted to help people the way Helen had helped her. Helen felt tears streaming down her face. She hugged Amira, then she hugged the boys. Then she hugged Fatima. They all stood there crying and laughing. The other medical personnel watched with confused but happy expressions. Luis asked what was going on. Helen explained through her tears. These were the children, the ones from the investigation, the ones she had been accused of treating illegally. Here they were, alive and healthy, and giving back to the world. This was why she did what she did. This was why the fight had been worth it. Fatima told Helen that Omar's testimony about human rights abuses had eventually led to an international investigation. Several officials had been prosecuted for war crimes. Justice had been served. But none of it would have been possible if Helen had not saved their children. If she had turned them away, if she had let politics determine who deserved medical care. Helen shook her head. She said she had just done her job. Fatima disagreed. She said Helen had done much more than her job. She had shown compassion. She had risked everything to do what was right. That was not just duty. That was heroism. They talked for over an hour. Amira told Helen about her studies, about the clinic she hoped to open someday, about her dream of providing free medical care to refugees. The boys, who were now 12 years old, talked about their school. They were both good students. One wanted to be an engineer. The other wanted to be a teacher like his father. Helen listened with her heart full. This was what it was all about. Not medals or promotions. Not recognition or glory. Just this: lives saved. Futures made possible. Hope restored. Before Fatima and her children left the ship, Helen gave Amira her contact information. She told the girl to stay in touch. She said she would help however she could. If Amira needed recommendations for medical school, if she needed advice, if she just needed someone to talk to, Helen would be there. Amira hugged her again. She promised to stay in touch. She said Helen was her hero, her inspiration. She would never forget what Helen had done for her. After they left, Helen stood on the deck again, watching the stars come out. The sky was clear and full of light. She thought about everything that had happened. The investigation, the hearing, the SEALs who had stood up for her son who had never lost faith in her, Admiral Collins who had fought for her, Commander Harper who had defended her, all the people who had believed in her when it would have been easier to let her fall. She thought about Senior Chief Carter, how he had organized the letter-writing campaign, how he had testified on her behalf, how he had reminded her that she was never alone. She wished he could see this, could see Amira healthy and pursuing her dreams, could see the proof that doing the right thing mattered. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. He was now a lieutenant commander serving as executive officer on a destroyer. He was next in line to command his own ship. The message said he had just learned he would be getting that command in 6 months. He wanted his mother to be there for the ceremony. Helen smiled and typed a reply. She said she would be there. Nothing would keep her away. She had missed his Naval Academy graduation. But she would not miss this. Some things were too important. The ship's captain approached Helen. Captain Victoria Barnes was a no-nonsense woman who had served for 28 years. She asked if Helen was okay. She had heard about the reunion with the refugee family. Helen said she was better than okay. She felt like everything in her life had led to this moment. All the sacrifices, all the struggles, all the pain. It had all been worth it. Captain Barnes smiled. She said that was what service was about, making a difference, leaving the world better than you found it. Helen agreed. They stood together looking out at the dark water. After a while, Captain Barnes said she had heard the story about Helen's investigation, about how she had been accused of providing aid to the enemy, about how she had fought back and won. She said it had become something of a legend in the Navy Medical Corps, a reminder that doing the right thing was not always easy, but it was always worth it. Helen was embarrassed. She said she had just done what anyone would have done. Captain Barnes shook her head. She said that was not true. Plenty of people would have taken the easy path, would have protected their careers instead of their principles. Helen had chosen differently. That took courage. Real courage. The kind that could not be taught. The kind that came from deep inside. The two women talked for a long time about service and sacrifice, about the challenges of being a woman in the military, about balancing career and family, about staying true to your values in a world that often seemed to have lost its way. Finally, Captain Barnes said she needed to get back to work. She thanked Helen for her service, for her example, for showing everyone what it meant to be a naval officer. Helen went back to her quarters. She lay on her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Jake, her husband, Ethan's father. He had been gone for 20 years now, but she still felt his presence sometimes, still heard his voice in her head encouraging her. She wondered what he would think of everything that had happened. She thought he would be proud, not because she had won, not because she had been vindicated, but because she had stood up for what was right, because she had refused to compromise her principles, because she had shown their son what honor meant. Helen closed her eyes and whispered thank you to all the people who had helped her, to the SEALs who had defended her, to the service members who had written letters, to her son who had never doubted her, to everyone who had believed in her. She was not a hero. She was just someone who tried to do her job with integrity. But if her story could inspire others to stand up for what was right, then maybe the ordeal had been worth it. Maybe the pain had served a purpose. The next morning, Helen woke early and went back to work. There were patients to treat, lives to save. That was what she did. 3 years after the investigation ended, Helen stood in a lecture hall at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. She had been promoted to captain. The silver eagles on her collar felt heavy with responsibility. She was now one of the senior medical officers at the hospital. But her favorite duty was teaching. Every month she gave a series of lectures to young Navy corpsmen preparing for deployment. These were kids mostly, 18 and 19 years old. Fresh out of training, full of energy and idealism, they had no idea what they were about to face. Helen's job was to prepare them, not just technically but mentally and emotionally. She needed to teach them how to stay human in inhuman situations. Today's class had 25 students. They sat in rows taking notes. Some looked nervous. Others looked eager. All of them looked young. Too young to be going to war. But that was not Helen's decision to make. Her job was to give them the tools they needed to survive and to help others survive. She began her lecture by talking about combat medicine, the kinds of injuries they would see: gunshot wounds, blast injuries, burns, traumatic amputations. She did not sugarcoat it. She showed them photographs. She described procedures. She wanted them to understand what they would be dealing with. But then she shifted to a different topic. She told them about the ethical challenges they would face, the difficult decisions, the gray areas where regulations and reality did not always align. She said the most important thing they needed to understand was that when they were in the field, they were not treating soldiers or civilians or enemies. They were treating human beings. Their job was to preserve life, not to make political judgments. The Geneva Convention existed for a reason. Medical personnel were held to a higher standard because they represented something better. One of the students raised his hand. He was a young man with red hair and freckles. He looked like he should be in high school, not preparing to go to a combat zone. He asked what Helen would do if treating someone put American lives at risk. What if the person they saved went on to hurt other people? It was a good question. Helen had been asked it many times over the years. She thought carefully before answering. She said that was a risk medical personnel accepted, because the alternative was to become the very thing they were fighting against. The enemy did not value human life. Americans did. That was the difference. That was what made the fight worthwhile. Sometimes the people they saved surprised them in good ways. Helen told them about the refugee family she had treated years ago, the 3 children who had been critically wounded, their father who had been suspected of being an insurgent. She explained how she had been investigated for treating them, how the investigation had nearly destroyed her career, but she also told them what had happened after. The intelligence about the father had been proven false. He was not an insurgent. He was a school teacher and human rights advocate. One of the children Helen had saved, a girl named Amira, had grown up to become a doctor. She now ran a clinic in Jordan treating refugees. She saved lives every day. If Helen had refused to treat Amira that day, if she had let politics override her duty, where would that girl be now? Where would all the people she helped be? The classroom was silent. The students were absorbing this. Helen continued. She said their job was simple. Save lives. That was it. The rest was above their pay grade. Let the politicians and generals worry about the bigger picture. Medical personnel needed to focus on the person in front of them who needed help. Do that with honor and integrity, and they could sleep at night no matter what else happened. A female student raised her hand. She asked if Helen ever regretted her decision to treat the refugee children, knowing what it had cost her. Helen answered immediately. She said she had no regrets. She would make the same choice again tomorrow. Her career, her reputation, her freedom, none of that mattered more than a child's life. That was what being a medical officer meant. That was the oath they all took. The student nodded slowly. She looked thoughtful. Helen wrapped up the lecture by talking about resilience. She said they would see terrible things. They would lose patience. They would make mistakes. They would face situations where there were no good options. That was the reality of combat medicine, but they had to keep going. They had to take care of themselves so they could take care of others. They had to lean on their teammates. Ask for help when they needed it. Remember why they had chosen this path. After the class ended, several students came up to talk to Helen. They thanked her for her honesty. They asked questions about specific scenarios. One young woman asked if she could contact Helen after her deployment if she needed advice. Helen gave her contact information without hesitation. She told all of them they could reach out any time. She meant it. When the last student left, Helen gathered her materials and walked through the hospital corridors. She passed the photographs of fallen heroes that lined the walls. She stopped at one particular photo. Senior Chief Daniel Carter. He had died 2 years earlier during a hostage rescue operation in Syria. He had saved 12 people before being killed by enemy fire. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Helen touched the photo gently. She whispered thank you. She did that every time she passed his picture. Carter had changed her life. He had stood up for her when no one else would. He had shown her what loyalty meant. She would never forget that. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with a young ensign rushing down the hallway. The officer skidded to a stop. He apologized quickly. Helen smiled. The ensign looked so much like Ethan had when he first started his career. Eager, idealistic, ready to take on the world. She asked where he was headed in such a hurry. The ensign said he was going to his first deployment briefing. He would be shipping out in 2 weeks. Helen wished him good luck. She told him to serve with honor and take care of his people. The ensign promised he would. Then he hurried off. Helen watched him disappear around a corner. So many young people ready to serve, ready to sacrifice. It was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. He was now a full lieutenant serving as operations officer on a cruiser. He had just gotten promoted again. He wanted to tell his mother the news over dinner. Helen smiled and typed a quick reply. She said she was proud of him and would love to have dinner. As she walked out of the hospital into the bright California sunshine, Helen thought about how far she had come. The investigation felt like a lifetime ago. She had been vindicated. Her career had survived. She had been promoted and honored. But more importantly, she had learned something valuable. She had learned that standing up for what was right always mattered, even when it was hard.
Even when it seemed like the whole world was against you.
Truth had a way of winning in the end. She had also learned that she was never alone. There was a family that extended beyond blood, a family of people who understood service and sacrifice. That family would always have each other's backs. Helen got into her car and drove toward the restaurant where she would meet Ethan. The sun was warm on her face. The sky was clear and blue. Everything felt right with the world. She thought about the young corpsmen she had taught that day. She hoped they would remember her lessons. She hoped they would face their challenges with courage and integrity. She hoped they would come home safe. But most of all, she hoped they would understand that their work mattered. That saving lives was the most important thing anyone could do. That was the legacy she wanted to leave. Not medals or promotions or recognition. Just the knowledge that she had made a difference. That she had saved lives. That she had stood up for what was right. As she drove, Helen passed a billboard advertising military recruitment. It showed a young sailor in dress blues. The slogan read, "Honor, Courage, Commitment." Helen smiled. Those were not just words. They were a way of life. They were what separated the good from the bad. They were what made service worthwhile. She had lived by those principles her entire career. She had paid a price for it. But she would not change anything. This was who she was. This was what she did. And she would keep doing it for as long as she could. Because somewhere out there was someone who needed help. Someone who was hurt or scared or dying. And Helen would be there for them. Just like she had always been. Just like she always would be. That was her promise. To her patients. To her fellow service members. To her son. To herself. She would never stop fighting for what was right. Never stop standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Never stop believing that one person could make a difference. That evening over dinner, Ethan told his mother about his new responsibilities. He talked about the challenges of his position, the long hours, the difficult decisions. He asked for her advice. Helen listened carefully. Then she told him what she had learned over her years of service. She said leadership was not about having all the answers. It was about caring for your people, making sure they had what they needed, standing up for them when they needed it, treating everyone with dignity and respect. Ethan nodded. He said that was what he was trying to do, but sometimes it was hard. Sometimes people disappointed you. Sometimes situations seemed impossible. Helen said that was normal.